In the autumn of 1872, the valley of Willow Creek lay nestled between the gentle slopes of the Appalachian foothills, a place where the rhythms of life were dictated by the turning of the seasons and the hard work of human hands. The nearest town, a collection of a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses, was a day's journey by wagon over roads that turned to mud with the slightest rain and became impassable under winter snows. Isolation was not merely a condition of geography but a way of life, fostering a deep reliance on one's own ingenuity and the quiet understanding that nature, while bountiful, could also be unforgiving. Here, every family was a self-contained unit, their survival dependent on the foresight and labor invested during the warmer months. Clara Henning lived on a small farmstead, a modest house of rough-hewn timber and a stone chimney that had seen better days. Her husband had passed 3 winters prior, leaving her to manage the land and its demands alone. At 34 years of age, Clara possessed a quiet strength, her frame lean and capable, her hands bearing the marks of countless hours spent tilling soil, mending fences, and tending to the needs of her small flock of chickens and a single milk cow. She was not given to idle chatter, preferring the company of her own thoughts and the steady cadence of work. Her garden was her pride, yielding an abundance of potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, and cabbages, enough to sustain her through the long, lean months of winter. Like her neighbors, she had always stored her harvest in the back room of her house, a space that, while cooler than the main living area, was still susceptible to the biting cold that seeped through the walls during the harshest weeks. Each year, she would lose a portion of her stores to frost, a frustrating but seemingly unavoidable consequence of winter's grip. That particular September, as the leaves began their slow transformation from green to gold, Clara embarked on a project that drew a mixture of quiet curiosity and outright skepticism from the few neighbors who learned of it. She announced her intention to dig a root cellar directly beneath her home, not a shallow pit for a few jars of preserves, but a substantial underground chamber, deep enough to escape the frost, and accessible by a trapdoor in her kitchen floor. When Samuel Pritchard, a seasoned farmer whose land bordered hers, stopped by to borrow a tool, he found Clara marking out the dimensions of her proposed excavation. He listened patiently as she described her plan, his weathered face etched with a mixture of respect for her ambition and doubt about its practicality. "A cellar, you say, Clara?" Samuel asked, his voice slow and deliberate. "Beneath the house? That's a mighty undertaking. The ground freezes hard here, deeper than a man is tall, and the damp, it'll rot your stores quicker than the cold." He paused, rubbing his chin. "Most folks find the back room sufficient, or a corner of the barn. It's always been so." Clara simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the earth she intended to move. She offered no lengthy explanation, no defense of her reasoning. She had learned that conviction, when truly held, required no elaborate justification. The truth of a thing would reveal itself in time. The news of Clara's unusual endeavor spread through the small community, carried on the infrequent visits between farmsteads and the weekly trip to the general store. The general sentiment was one of gentle bewilderment. Why such an immense effort for something that seemed adequately handled by existing methods? A cellar was a damp, dark place, prone to mildew and vermin, people murmured. The ground was too cold, the work too arduous. It was an unnecessary departure from established practice, a folly born of a widow's solitary stubbornness. Yet no one voiced outright condemnation, for Clara was known for her quiet competence, and her decisions, however unconventional, were always rooted in a practical purpose. Clara, however, paid little mind to the murmurs. She understood that her neighbors spoke from their own experiences, their own understanding of the world. Their skepticism was not born of malice, but of a natural inclination towards the familiar. She knew, too, that the true measure of her decision would not be found in their initial reactions, but in the outcome of the coming winter. If you find yourself drawn to stories of quiet determination and the wisdom found in observation, please consider giving this video a like. Subscribing helps us share more narratives that highlight the enduring power of human ingenuity. And if you would, leave a comment below with your city and country. It's a small gesture, but it helps us connect with a wider community, showing how these timeless lessons resonate across different places and times. The first spadeful of earth was turned on a crisp morning in late September. The air was still carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, a harbinger of the colder months to come. Clara had removed a section of her kitchen floorboards, revealing the dark, compacted soil beneath. She marked out a rectangle roughly 7 feet long and 5 feet wide, a space that would eventually become the heart of her winter preservation. The initial digging was slow, the earth dense and interwoven with a network of fine roots from the ancient oak that stood nearby. Each shovelful was heavy, requiring a deliberate effort to lift and deposit onto a growing mound outside her front door. By the end of the first day, she had managed to excavate a depression, barely reaching her knees. The second day saw her descend further, the walls of the pit rising around her as she worked, the sounds of her labor muffled by the earth. She established a steady rhythm, working in the cool hours of the morning and again in the late afternoon, reserving the midday for other farm chores, milking the cow, gathering eggs, and preparing simple meals. The progress was incremental, measured in inches rather than feet, but each day brought her closer to her goal. Neighbors, passing on their way to town or to tend their own fields, would sometimes pause, their eyes drawn to the growing pile of earth and the open trap door in Clara's kitchen. They would offer a nod, sometimes a brief, shouted greeting, but no one offered to help, nor did Clara expect it. This was her undertaking, a solitary endeavor born of her own conviction. As the excavation deepened, Clara observed the changing character of the soil. The rich, dark topsoil gave way to a layer of reddish clay, dense and heavy, then to a stratum of sand mixed with small, smooth stones. She noted these transitions with an almost unconscious understanding, a knowledge gleaned from years of working the land. She knew that clay held moisture, that sand allowed for drainage, and that the deeper earth maintained a more stable temperature, shielded from the sun's heat and the winter's cold. These were not abstract scientific principles, but tangible facts revealed by the very soil she was moving. She had seen her father, a man of few words but profound practical wisdom, read the land in a similar fashion, understanding its nuances as one might understand the temperament of a familiar animal. By mid-October, the cellar hole reached a depth of 8 feet. The air at the bottom was noticeably cooler and stiller than the air above, carrying a faint, earthy scent. Clara fashioned a sturdy ladder from 2 long pine poles and several oak rungs, securing it firmly within the pit. Each morning she would descend into the cool darkness, and each evening she would climb out, her muscles aching, her hands calloused, but her resolve undimmed. Samuel Pritchard, on another visit, peered down into the shadowy depths. "Still at it, Clara?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly. "That's a deep hole. What keeps it from collapsing?" "The earth is firm at this depth," Clara replied, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "And I'll line it with stone." "Stone?" Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Where will you find enough stone for that?" "From the creek bed," she said, gesturing vaguely towards the lower pasture. "And there's a collapsed wall on the old north boundary. Plenty there." Samuel grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, from grudging admiration to continued skepticism. He did not offer assistance, and Clara did not ask. The work of building was as much a part of the preparation as the finished structure itself. It was a process of understanding, of connecting with the materials and the environment, a silent conversation between human effort and natural law. The task of gathering and hauling stone began the following week. The creek bed, usually a trickle in the dry season, yielded a plentiful supply of flat, weathered stones, perfect for lining the cellar walls. Clara loaded them into a sturdy wooden wheelbarrow, each trip a slow, arduous journey up the gentle slope towards her house. The wheelbarrow's iron-rimmed wheel groaned and caught on roots, demanding constant attention and strength. She made 8, sometimes 10, trips a day, her shoulders burning, her legs weary. The October air grew sharper, and the mornings brought a thin layer of frost that sparkled on the grass before melting under the midday's sun. The leaves on the oak tree outside her window had turned a brilliant crimson and were beginning to fall, carpeting the ground in a rustling tapestry of colour. The days grew noticeably shorter, the evenings drawing in with a swiftness that spoke of winter's approach. Lining the cellar walls was a meticulous process, requiring a different kind of strength and patience. Clara selected each stone with care, fitting them together like pieces of a complex puzzle. She used a simple mortar, a mixture of clay and sand from her own land, mixed with water to bind the stones and fill the smaller gaps. She worked from the bottom up, laying each course with precision, ensuring the wall leaned slightly inward, a subtle but crucial detail for stability. Her hands, despite the thick leather gloves she wore, became raw and chapped, her knuckles often cracked and bleeding. Yet, she continued, driven by an inner certainty that this effort was not merely labor, but an investment in the future, a tangible expression of her understanding of the world. The physical logic of the task was deeply satisfying. Stone, she knew, held coolness. Earth provided insulation. Depth offered protection. These were not new ideas, but ancient truths passed down through generations of those who lived close to the land, tested and proven by countless winters. As the stone walls rose, the character of the cellar transformed. The air within became even more distinct, a constant, cool stillness that felt utterly separate from the fluctuating temperatures above ground. When she descended the ladder, the air met her with a gentle embrace, neither warm nor cold, but a steady, unchanging coolness. She would press her hand against the newly laid stone, feeling the deep, consistent chill that emanated from the earth itself, a coolness that promised to endure regardless of the weather's caprice. It was a feeling of profound stability, a testament to the earth's unwavering presence beneath the shifting surface. One afternoon, Thomas Pritchard, Samuel's eldest son, stopped by. He was a young man, earnest and observant, though still learning the deeper lessons of farming. He peered into the cellar, his brow furrowed in thought. "It's deep, Mrs. Henning," he remarked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "And those walls look strong, but my father says the cold will find its way in, no matter how deep you dig. He says the ground freezes solid all the way down." Clara paused, resting her hands on the edge of the trapdoor opening. "The ground freezes, yes, Thomas, but only to a certain depth. Below that, the earth holds a constant temperature year-round. It's like a well. A well never freezes, no matter how cold the winter, because the water comes from deep within the earth, below the frost line." Thomas considered this, his gaze still fixed on the cool, stone-lined space. He nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I suppose we'll see," he said, a common refrain in a community where experience was the ultimate teacher. And Clara knew they would. The principle was not complex, but it required a shift in perspective, a willingness to look beyond the immediate surface. The earth's surface was indeed subject to the whims of the seasons, baking under the summer sun and hardening under winter's frost. But beneath that fluctuating layer, at a depth known as the frost line, the temperature remained remarkably stable, influenced more by the earth's internal warmth and the insulating properties of the soil than by the extreme variations of the weather above. Clara had observed this phenomenon throughout her life, the cool, refreshing water drawn from a deep well in the height of summer, the way a buried root remained unfrozen even when the ground above was iron-hard. These were not mysteries, but natural laws waiting to be understood and utilized. A cellar, properly dug and insulated, simply harnessed these inherent properties of the earth. It captured the earth's natural coolness in summer and shielded its contents from the biting cold of winter, creating a sanctuary where food could rest in a state of suspended animation, neither freezing nor rotting. She did not expect her neighbors to grasp this immediately, nor did she resent their skepticism. Proof, she knew, would be far more convincing than any explanation. The cellar was finally completed by the first week of November. Clara constructed a sturdy trapdoor from thick oak planks, fitting it with heavy iron hinges and a simple, secure latch. Inside, she built shelves along two of the stone walls, crafting them from rough-sawn lumber, spacing them to accommodate crates of vegetables, jars of preserves, and sacks of grain. She swept the stone floor clean, removing every last speck of dust and debris. Then she descended the ladder one final time, a lantern held aloft, to inspect her work. The space was dry, cool and silent, the air still and clean. The stone walls felt solid and unyielding, a testament to her labor. Satisfied, she climbed back up, closed the trapdoor, and began the arduous but rewarding task of transferring her harvest from the back room to its new subterranean home. Potatoes, carefully sorted and inspected for any blemishes, were placed in wooden crates. Carrots and turnips were layered in boxes of damp sand, a traditional method to prevent them from drying out. Cabbages, their outer leaves still intact, were hung from hooks in the ceiling beams, allowing air to circulate around them. Onions, their papery skins rustling softly, were arranged in shallow baskets. Apples, each one chosen for its firmness and lack of bruising, filled another crate. Beets, parsnips, and a few late-harvest squashes completed the stores. Clara worked steadily through the afternoon and into the evening, carrying each load down the ladder, arranging it on the shelves with meticulous care. When the last item was placed, she stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the dim, cool space, now filled with the bounty of her garden. The cellar was full, organized, and ready for the long winter ahead. With her harvest safely stored, Clara returned to the familiar rhythms of preparing her farm for winter. The days grew noticeably shorter, and the sky often hung low and grey, heavy with the promise of snow. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper in autumn, now carried a sharper edge, a cold breath from the north that spoke of distant, frozen lands. Clara stacked firewood along the sheltered side of her house, a towering mound that would fuel her hearth through the coldest months. She checked the chimney for blockages, repaired a loose shutter that rattled in the wind, and sealed any remaining gaps in her window frames with strips of cloth soaked in tallow. These were the annual rituals of survival, performed with the same quiet diligence she had applied to her cellar, a testament to her understanding that preparation was a continuous, multifaceted endeavor. By mid-November, the first snow arrived, a light, tentative dusting that melted by noon, but it was merely a prelude. 3 days later, a heavier snowfall descended, blanketing the valley in a pristine white layer several inches deep. Clara woke each morning to a world transformed, the familiar landscape softened and muted by the snow, the distant hills blurred into indistinct shapes. The air was crisp and bitingly cold, and her breath plumed in white clouds before her. She noted the depth of the snow, its texture, the way it clung to the bare branches of the trees and lay undisturbed in the open fields. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the cold now possessed a tangible presence, seeping into every corner of the world. She made it a daily practice to descend into her cellar, lifting the heavy trapdoor and climbing down into the cool, still air below. She would check her stores, running her hands over the potatoes, the carrots, the apples. Each item remained firm and intact, showing no signs of freezing or decay. The air in the cellar maintained its steady, cool temperature, a stark contrast to the bitter chill that now gripped the world above. The earth, she observed, was holding its promise. The stable temperature below ground was a silent, unwavering guardian of her winter provisions. Above ground, the cold intensified with a ferocity that surpassed anything Clara had experienced in recent memory. The thermometer nailed to her porch post registered 10 degrees below zero at midday, and the nights plunged into depths where water left in a bucket overnight froze solid, expanding with enough force to split the wood. The wind became a relentless howling force, finding every crack and crevice, driving icy tendrils through the walls of her house and under her doors. Clara burned firewood at an alarming rate, feeding the stove almost constantly to keep the interior of her home above freezing. Even so, delicate patterns of frost formed on the inside of her window panes, shimmering like intricate lace in the faint light. Her milk cow huddled miserably in the barn, its breath steaming in the frigid air. Clara wrapped the animal in old blankets and fed her extra hay, doing everything she could to maintain her warmth. The chickens, usually bustling with activity, became lethargic, their energy devoted entirely to survival, their egg production ceasing entirely. The water trough in the barn froze solid despite Clara's efforts to break the ice twice daily, forcing her to melt snow in a large kettle on her wood stove to provide drinking water for her animals. The world outside had become a harsh, unforgiving place, demanding constant vigilance and effort, simply to endure. One afternoon, driven by a quiet concern for her neighbours, Clara decided to make the arduous journey to the Pritchard farm. She bundled herself in layers of wool and thick canvas, pulling her hat low over her ears, and set out through snow that reached above her knees. The half-mile walk was a struggle, each step a deliberate effort against the deep drifts and the biting wind. Samuel met her at his door, his face etched with worry, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Inside, despite a roaring fire in the hearth, the house felt cold, and the entire family was huddled together in the main room, wrapped in blankets and thick coats. Samuel's wife, Margaret, offered Clara a cup of weak, lukewarm tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. She gestured towards the back room, where they typically stored their winter provisions. "It's been a terrible cold, Clara," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Half our potatoes froze solid. Turned black and soft, had to throw them out before they spoiled the rest. The turnips, too. Even with the fire going day and night, the cold just seeps into that room. It's as if the walls offer no protection at all. Samuel nodded grimly. We've been trying to salvage what we can, but it's going faster than we planned. This cold, it's too much for the usual ways. Clara listened, her expression unreadable. She mentioned, simply, that her own stores were holding well. Margaret looked at her, a question forming in her eyes, but she did not voice it. Clara finished her tea, offered her thanks, and began the difficult walk back to her farm as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The silence of the landscape was broken only by the crunch of her boots and the relentless whisper of the wind. The pattern of loss and hardship was repeated throughout the valley. When Clara made the difficult journey into town the following week, pulling a small sled behind her to carry her purchases, she heard similar reports from other families. Root vegetables, the staple of winter diets, had frozen solid in back rooms and unheated sheds. Cabbages had turned to mush, apples to black, inedible pulp. The traditional storage methods, which had served adequately in milder winters, were proving utterly insufficient against the sustained and extreme cold. People spoke of rationing their dwindling supplies, of stretching every last bit of food, and of hoping for an early thaw that seemed increasingly unlikely. The storekeeper, his face drawn, mentioned that he had sold the last of his canned goods days ago, and did not expect another shipment until the roads cleared, which might not happen until late December, or even January, if the snow continued to fall. Clara purchased a small bag of flour and a tin of lard, essential items that were becoming increasingly scarce. She then began the long, arduous journey home, pulling her sled through the deep snow. The sky was a heavy, uniform grey, pregnant with the promise of more precipitation, and the wind had not relented its icy assault. She reached her house as dusk settled, her face numb with cold, her fingers stiff despite the thick wool gloves she wore. She immediately stoked the fire, fed her animals, and then, with a sense of quiet satisfaction, descended into her cellar to retrieve potatoes and carrots for her evening meal. The vegetables were perfect, cool to the touch but not frozen, firm and ready for cooking. She carried them upstairs, closed the trapdoor, and began to prepare a simple, nourishing stew, the warmth of her stove a comforting contrast to the relentless bitter cold that raged outside. December arrived with an even greater intensity of snow and no sign of a reprieve from the cold. The drifts piled against the sides of her house, reaching the windowsills, and the road became utterly impassable except on foot, and even then with great difficulty. Clara remained isolated on her farm, her days consumed by the essential tasks of survival, feeding her animals, maintaining the fire, melting snow for water, and, crucially, checking her stores. The cellar continued to perform exactly as she had intended, its temperature stable, its contents perfectly preserved. She rationed her supplies carefully, not out of immediate necessity, for she had plenty, but out of a deep-seated understanding that winter was a long and unpredictable season, and that true preparation extended beyond mere abundance. It required wisdom in its management and use. The isolation, while challenging, brought a quietness that Clara did not mind. She had always found a certain solace in solitude, preferring the steady rhythms of work and the silent companionship of the natural world to the often frivolous chatter of human company. In the evenings, by the flickering light of her oil lamp, she would read from her worn Bible or a collection of essays on agricultural practices, the words familiar and comforting. She mended clothes, sharpened tools, and meticulously planned the work she would undertake when spring finally returned. The cold was a constant presence, a formidable adversary, but it was one she met with the same steady determination she brought to all challenges. It was a test, and she was prepared. In the third week of December, a figure appeared on the horizon, struggling through the deep snow towards her farm. It was Thomas Pritchard, Samuel's eldest son, his face red and chapped from the cold, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. He arrived at her door, stamping snow from his boots, and explained, his voice tinged with desperation, that his family's supplies had dwindled to a critical level. The frozen stores had long since been discarded, and what little remained was insufficient to see them through to the new year. Margaret, his mother, had sent him with a small amount of money and a humble, almost pleading request for whatever Clara might be able to spare. Clara did not hesitate. She led Thomas into her kitchen, opened the heavy trapdoor, and descended into the cool, earthy darkness of her cellar. Thomas followed, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light cast by the lantern Clara carried. He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the shelves lined with crates and baskets, the vegetables intact and fresh, the air cool but not frigid. Clara selected a large crate of potatoes, a basket of firm turnips, and a smaller box of crisp carrots, enough to sustain a family of 5 for at least 2 weeks, provided they were used judiciously. She handed them up to Thomas, who accepted them with a stunned expression, his mouth slightly agape. "How is this possible, Mrs. Henning?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief, his eyes still fixed on the abundant stores around him. "Everything we had froze solid. Our back room was like an icebox. How did yours survive?" Clara climbed the ladder and stood beside him, her expression calm. "The cellar is below the frost line, Thomas. The earth insulates it. The temperature down there does not change with the weather above ground." Thomas shook his head slowly, a dawning realization spreading across his face. "My father. He said it wouldn't work. He said the cold would get in just the same." "The cold did not get in," Clara stated simply, her voice devoid of triumph or accusation. It was merely a statement of fact. Thomas carried the heavy crates and baskets outside, carefully loading them onto the small sled he had brought. He thanked Clara with words that seemed inadequate to express the relief and gratitude he felt, and she dismissed his effusive thanks with a quiet wave of her hand. It was not charity, but a simple act of practical assistance. She had enough, and they had need. That was the only equation that mattered. Word of Clara's cellar and the miraculous preservation of her food spread quickly through the valley after Thomas's return. Within days, other families, their own provisions dwindling, made the difficult journey to her farm, their faces etched with worry, their requests humble. They asked if she could spare anything from her stores, offering what little money or goods they had left. Clara helped where she could, distributing portions of her harvest to those who came, never demanding payment, often accepting nothing at all. The cellar, which had once been a subject of quiet skepticism and gentle ridicule, now became a focal point of fascination and profound respect. People asked her how she had known, how she had understood the principles that now, in hindsight, seemed so undeniably clear. Clara offered simple, direct explanations describing the stable temperature of the deep earth, the insulating properties of soil and stone, and the practical wisdom her father had imparted to her years ago. Some listened intently, nodding as the pieces of understanding fell into place. Others simply accepted the undeniable evidence of her success without needing to fully grasp the underlying mechanisms. Samuel Pritchard himself arrived in early January, when the worst of the cold had finally begun to ease its grip, and the temperature had climbed back into a range where life felt, once again, sustainable. He stood in Clara's kitchen, looking down through the open trapdoor into the cool, earthy depths of the cellar, a rueful smile playing on his lips. "I should have listened, Clara," he said, his voice low and tinged with regret. "I thought it was unnecessary work, a folly. I was wrong, terribly wrong." Clara offered him a cup of hot coffee, which he accepted gratefully. They sat at her small kitchen table by the window, watching the pale winter sun reflect off the snow, and talked not of blame or regret, but of the lessons learned. Samuel mentioned that he intended to dig a cellar of his own come spring, and that several other families had expressed the same intention. The winter had been a harsh teacher, but its lessons had been clear and undeniable. Preparation was not about predicting the future with certainty, but about understanding the enduring patterns that governed the natural world. The earth, he now understood, offered stability and protection to those willing to work with it, to those who understood its deeper rhythms. The cold was not an enemy to be feared, but a condition to be respected, understood, and planned for with foresight and diligence. As January slowly gave way to February, the weather gradually relented. The days grew fractionally longer, and the temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks. The deep snow began to settle and compact, and on clear days the sun carried a faint, almost imperceptible warmth that hinted at the eventual return of spring. Clara's stores, though diminished by her generosity to her neighbours, remained more than sufficient for her own needs. The cellar had served its purpose, preserving her harvest through the most severe cold anyone in the valley could remember, and proving, beyond any doubt, that the old knowledge, the deep understanding of how the earth worked, remained as valuable and essential as it had ever been. The recognition Clara received was quiet, expressed in nods of respect, in heartfelt words of thanks, and in the way her neighbours now paused to ask her advice on matters of farming, preservation, and preparation. She did not seek their praise, nor did she dwell on her vindication. She had simply done what she believed was right, guided by observation, logic, and a deep-seated trust in the natural world. The results had spoken for themselves, and that, for Clara, was reward enough. Spring arrived slowly, tentatively, the snow melting in patches, revealing the muddy, raw earth beneath. In late March, Clara opened her cellar for the last time that season, removing the final remnants of her winter stores. She inspected each potato, each carrot, noting that many of the potatoes had begun to sprout, a clear sign that they had been held in ideal conditions, neither too cold to freeze nor too warm to spoil prematurely. She carefully set aside the best of the sprouting potatoes for planting in her spring garden and used the rest for her meals. The shelves now stood empty, awaiting the bounty of the next harvest. Clara meticulously cleaned the stone walls and swept the floor, then closed the trapdoor, turning her attention to the garden, where the soil awaited turning and the season's new work awaited her capable hands. The legacy of that severe winter lived on, not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet, practical actions of the community. In the years that followed, the valley saw a proliferation of new root cellars, each one dug deep beneath homes, each one modelled, in its essential principles, after Clara's design. By the next autumn, 5 more families had built their own subterranean storage spaces, with stone walls and deep foundations that reached below the frost line. The knowledge spread, passed from neighbour to neighbour, becoming a new kind of common sense where it had once been dismissed as an eccentric folly. The winters that followed were never quite as brutal as that winter of 1872, but the cellars served their purpose year after year, preserving harvests and providing a quiet, enduring security against the uncertainties of weather and season. Clara Henning lived on her farm for another 30 years, a quiet, respected figure in the community. She continued to tend her garden, care for her animals, and maintain the cellar that had so eloquently proven her foresight. She became known in the valley not as someone who had possessed a mystical ability to predict the future, but as someone who had paid careful attention to the past, who had listened to the lessons her father had taught, and who had observed the enduring patterns that governed the natural world. Her stubbornness, once perceived as a solitary quirk, was now understood as a profound strength, a refusal to accept the easy, conventional path when a more thoughtful, more arduous one promised greater resilience. She did not speak often about that particular winter, but when asked, she would offer the same simple explanation she had given Thomas Pritchard all those years ago. The earth holds what you give it, if you dig deep enough and build well. The lesson of Clara's cellar extended far beyond the practicalities of preserving food. It touched upon something more fundamental about the human condition, about the way people lived and prepared for the inevitable hardships of life. The future, with all its uncertainties, could never be fully known, but the principles that governed survival, the enduring truths of observation, patience, effort, and a deep respect for the natural world remained consistent. These principles provided a foundation that the shifting winds of weather and chance could not easily shake. Those who prepared without fanfare, who worked diligently when others might have rested, who trusted their own judgment even when it was met with skepticism, often found that their efforts were rewarded not with applause or public acclaim, but with results. And for those who understood the true nature of enduring, those results were the only reward that truly mattered. If this story has offered you a moment of reflection, a quiet insight into the enduring wisdom of preparation and observation, I would be deeply grateful if you would take a moment to leave a like on this video. Subscribing to our channel helps us continue to share more narratives like this one, stories that honor the quiet strength of those who prepare, observe, and act with intention. And please, we would be honored if you would leave a comment below with your city and country. It helps us understand how far these timeless lessons reach and reminds us that the principles of foresight and respect for the natural world are universal, connecting us all no matter where we live or what challenges we may face. Thank you for watching, and may you always find stability and wisdom in the work you do today for the uncertainties of tomorrow.